Hello everyone, welcome to another artwork analysis. Now I've talked about a lot of different artists from different industries, but there's one industry I completely forgot to really talk about, and that's really the comic industry. Now, as an ease-in, I wanted to talk about an artist who takes inspiration from different sources, and that's Bengal. He's a French artist who has an anime influence in his comic work. Surprise, given that I am a big anime fan and I really like it when artists try to take from the West and the East and mix them in a harmony. So for Bengal, I want to talk about comics perspective and how they utilize perspective to create story through space, and I want to talk about colors as well briefly. So, perspective. When you look at a lot of comic artists, one of the biggest things that they really do well is the fact that they have really good perspective drawings. Of course, they have to do things in space. It has to make sense, right? They're not doing abstract art, and they have to really create actiony scenes. Now, what I mean by actiony scenes is, of course, if you are trying to do a superhero comic, Superman needs to be doing crazy stuff, and you want to portray certain movements when it comes to perspective. So, in this case, Bengal is no exception. When you look at a lot of his work, he always has these very dynamic perspectives. So, that's something I really haven't talked about yet, and how you use perspective to create your story. A lot of people, when they start out, they're taught that, hey, you have to do this certain thing with perspective, and there's like a horizon line, and you have to follow the horizon line in order to get your vanishing point, and everything has to converge, etc., etc. But one thing you have to notice is that composition always comes first. Your story, your message always comes first. So in Bengal's case, when we follow the perspective lines, I'm going to just do it roughly. I'm not going to use a ruler. For anyone who's doing very technical perspective drawings, you should use a ruler, by the way. But we're going with a 3-point perspective here. Notice how I'm going to use a different color actually. Notice how these are the 2 points, and then the third would be going downwards. Now I won't really try to talk about too much about perspective in the case of technical drawing. You can always buy a book on Amazon for $5 and it'll teach you how to do that. But the hardest part is to justify your perspective in order to create the composition that you need. So in this case, he deliberately planned all these characters to be doing certain things in order to have a perspective that he needs. It's kind of hard to describe, but think about it this way. Of course, this is for I guess this is official art. It's promoted by Overwatch. So you notice that probably he had to put Tracer here, and then had to put Mercy, and then I think the Zarya at the top here doing a pull-up. So already there's May here as well. So already 4 main characters, and then you have Winston in the background. That's a negligible part because he's not really in space. He's jumping around, he's falling down or whatever. So he could you could get away with more liberties with him, but with Tracer, Mercy, May, and Zarya, I would assume he doesn't. Bengal doesn't really have. He can't have abstract perspective, if that makes sense. He has to put these characters in a rhythm that he wants. So he probably, when he was planning, he was like, I want Tracer to be in the foreground here, and then Mercy deliberately in the space that she occupies here, and then May in the back as well, and of course Zarya here. He would have had to plan it out like this. If the perspective was different, then of course Mercy could be here, but that will not make the composition work for us. First of all, he most likely planned the composition without perspective in mind, and then used perspective in order to place these characters exactly where he is. I want to repeat that. Never think of your composition through a technical perspective drawing first. You always want to talk about your story. What are you trying to portray in your piece first, and then use perspective to justify the positionings of your characters. This is very important. I know that when you are in art school, you are most likely taught the perspective first. It's like, oh, I have to, since you're doing a technical drawing, I would have to draw the horizon line first. This is a very dynamic perspective, by the way. He's not only doing a horizontal horizon line, he's doing an angled one. This automatically creates a very dynamic composition, by the way. If you're looking to create this sort of effect, just tilt your horizon line a bit. So anyways, he most likely would not have drawn this horizon line first. He would most likely not have drawn the vanishing points and the perspective lines first. I'll draw it out anyways. There is no way he would have started his thumbnails, his sketch, sorry, based on the perspective first. In fact, sometimes you could even break it a little bit. So in this case, he doesn't really do that. But one of the things that my layout animation teacher taught me in second year is, if you're looking to break perspective, you sort of have to do it tastefully. Sometimes you could tilt a few lines here or there to make your composition better. All for the sake of trying to make your to force your perspective in order to create your composition, not the other way around. Never try to plan on perspective first, because, of course, you might have perfect perspective, but your artwork might just look bad. And Bengal definitely placed these characters very well. He would have been like, okay, I need Tracer here, I need Mercy here, Zarya here, May, whatever, etc., etc. So always think about your story before your perspective, and use your perspective to justify your composition. Now, I want to talk about a little bit about story too. So, story through space. We have to think about priorities, and Bengal, when he was planning this, probably had to think about what he was looking to do with this composition. Now, of course, story-wise, we notice that Tracer is actually doing the most. Let's use a different color. That's really hard to see. Tracer is doing the most dynamic, most interesting activity here. Look at the silhouette. Very dynamic. when you look at Tracer official art, you notice that her silhouettes are always very strong, very, very eye-catching. That's the character that she has. She's a very dynamic, very athletic type of character. And then as you go into space, you start having less and less dynamic things going on. So notice how even for Mercy, you can see a very deliberate action here, very deliberate silhouettes, fitting for her character as well. She's more of the when you look at Mercy, you'll probably think she's more of a she is a doctor in the lore. So she's not to say doctors can't be athletic, but in her case, she's definitely the type to be more chill. Not going to be super fast or like Tracer. Then you notice how May is an even less dynamic silhouette. And then you have Zarya here as well, I guess you could say. Hers is pretty dynamic as well, but she's kind of faded into the perspective and not really that important. Now, of course, we have Winston here as well for comedic effect here. Basically, it's just an afterthought. He's back in the back. He's not really standing out too much. It's sort of like, oh, that's pretty funny. He's the back sort of thing. Not really part of the focal points. So as you can see here, he prioritized his story based on the actions that they are doing. So when you're creating perspective, you notice that immediately Tracer stands out because of her silhouette, and she's the closest in space, and she's colored in such a way that she's catching attention. So you see how her hair is very dark with her face, which is pale-skinned. Whereas Mercy, of course, kind of doesn't stand out as much, and then May definitely doesn't stand out as much, and Zara, you go and see her butt. So, what I mean by this is, again, you plan out your story, know that we are always, as an audience, going to look from our closest view into space. So, that's not to say that you can't have Mercy be the main focal point, but you have to think about it this way. You have to really combine everything from colors to perspective to silhouettes in order to create priority. It's sort of like having, let's say, a list. One thing I did when I was starting out too was, before every composition, I'll be like, okay, I want to have... Oh, that's a little bit small here. So my main focal point is, let's say I'm Bengal here. It's Tracer, and then Mercy, and then May, Zarya, and then, of course, we have really on point, but still comedic effect. There's Winston. So when you're planning out your piece, you're going to be looking at, okay, I need to have a hierarchy of just what catches attention, and then plan it out. Understand that our natural instinct is, of course, looking at what is closest to us before going into space. So how do I make sure that we go with the hierarchy that we have through space? And of course, you go back into to composition and perspective in order to justify this type of thing. And of course, notice how she's also in the rule of third type of thing, which is, of course, commonly used for your most attractive, what you want to attract the most attention with. I want to make a final note on color. So, one thing that stood out for me in this piece too is how he kind of alternates between warms and cools, and how he kind of breaks the convention of what we think that is in distance versus what is in the foreground. So you might have been taught that warm colors are always going to stand out, and cool colors are always going to be in the background. But you notice that even in the background, there are warms. So the rule of thumb isn't really about all warms or advanced cools are in the background. Yes, Tracer is very warm. Of course, she's wearing a very orange tank top, and of course, her skin is very contrasting with her hair and such. But notice how the environment is cool as well. This base here. It's interesting, right? Like, cools are the foreground and midground elements, and the backgrounds are actually the warm colors of the, I guess, almost sunset type of environment. So, what am I trying to say here? Don't look at colors as if there's a hard line of what works and what doesn't. Always look into why. Why do these colors need to exist? So, in this instance, what I noticed is that Tracer is also on a very cool backdrop under her, and as with the rest of the characters too. So he planned it out in that, okay, these characters are warm, and the space that they're in is cool, so they stand out more. We don't have to think about, okay, the foreground has to be warm, the characters have to be warm because they are in the foreground. Always try to think about how will you create distance in your work. Alternate. So one rule that, well, not rule, I guess you could say one principle that a lot of people do is no matter what you choose, no matter what colors you choose, as you go into distance, you really want to alternate it. You don't want to have a flat color throughout the entire space. Because let's say we did this or something. Let's say we did something like this. It's infinitely less interesting, right? Even though we could say, oh, well, the background is still warm, the foreground is all cool, it has to be alternating this. Make it more interesting. And of course, in this case, it kills the composition because now the warms of the background take precedence as focal points. Again, use colors to justify what you need. Always justify what you need. With perspective, with space, with colors. And this is why I really like looking at comic artists too, even though my video series here doesn't really say that. Comic artists bring something that a lot of other artists don't need to bring, and perspective is obviously one of them. And of course, putting a lot of characters in one scene, actiony, dynamic scenes as well. Always look at it as every industry has something special that everyone can bring. And you'll learn a lot more, and maybe you'll find something that you really like. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.